These are my two visual aids. Often when people think about the game lacrosse, their first impression is maybe it's a game played by wealthy, privileged, white, upper-class Americans. But what they don't know is that the game's origin is the complete opposite. It was actually a game first played by Native Americans. The first fields for the game weren't like those we see today. It didn't adhere to a field of 115 yards or last 1 hour. It wasn't the finesse sport that we see today. The stick Native Americans used wasn't molded with plastic and strung with synthetic strings. They were carved from wood and strung with leather strings. Nowadays, the competition in the sport isn't organized for tribal training, but by community, college, and professional leagues for championship titles. While a lot about the game has changed, a lot has not. And that's what makes the sport so genuine to its legacy and challenging to every player that picks up a stick. Native Americans paved the way by maintaining an important part of our country's history and by passing this sport down generation to generation. Let's look back at the early years of the game lacrosse. Let me start by telling you when, where, and who started this game. You can trace lacrosse back to North American Indians in the early 1600s. It was picked up by the Canadians in Thunder Bay, Ontario. These Canadians then turned the game into their national sport in 1867. There were over 80 club teams in Canada, and then the U.S. formed the first all-white team, and they played against the Indians. But the Indians usually won because of their aggressive nature and the way they learned to play the game. When Americans started to compete in the game, they found it difficult and faced defeat quite often. This resulted in the changing of the game's rules, and that will help me move forward into the different rules involved in the game and why there's so little influence in the game with Indians in the game today. Back when Indians played, there wasn't a 115-yard field and 10 players on each team on the field at the time, and the game wasn't 60 minutes. The game consisted of two tribes playing against each other, having as many as 1,000 people involved, and the goal was spread over a distance of miles. The games were played at times to settle territorial disputes. The most famous game was in 1763 at Fort Michilimackinac. Many Michigan tribes got together to attack the English. They all joined together to fight for their land, and they won. Men and women were both involved in this. Nowadays, there are women's and men's teams, but during the early years, teams were co-ed. Games would have a ratio of 5 women to every man on the field. Games weren't played for community, college, or professional national championships. They were for more important reasons. They would play the game during a religious holiday or for the change of season. There were spiritual events. Some included funerals and having famous warriors or players being buried with their sticks. Even the stick has been transformed. Modern sticks are made molded of plastic and strung with synthetic mesh lining. The Native Americans played with hand-carved wooden sticks strung with traditional leather. During the game's evolution, the traditional feel of play has changed. The game's Native American customs demised, and the stick has been transformed and redesigned. But those aren't the only changes. Even the way the game is played has been changed because of the different rules. There are many changes in the rules of conduct and the way the game was played, and how the controversies involved. Indians didn't have strong rules, and that had a lot to do with the massive amounts of victories against the all-white teams in the United States. With the Indians, you could tackle, wrestle, trip, ram, charge, and slash. In some Indian games, 2 players would just drop their sticks and go at it. It was familiarized with cockfighting. Here's a picture of what it may have looked like. They initiated these rules in a fight to stop letting Native Americans on these white teams. The Indians were being pushed out of the game they started, similar to how they had been pushed from their homelands in their history. The new North American rules eliminated slashing, tripping, or fighting. Breaking any of these rules would result in a penalty in the game today. While Native Americans were being pushed out, lacrosse started to be a game dominated by whites, and very little homage was given to Native Americans who had great influence in the game's early beginnings. There were many influential athletes in the sport ignored or placed on the back burner to the sport. Native Americans weren't given credit for being the originators of the war game that became sport for years. Their contribution and credit for the game's history wasn't fully recognized. There were many African Americans involved in the game that made a lot of difference in all aspects of the game. The first known African American lacrosse player was Albert Lewis. He was a Canadian goalie and was known as one of the greatest Canadians of all time. The first African American lacrosse player to play in college was Simon Moss at Rutgers University. But the most famous African American player is former NFL player Jim Brown. Known for his incredible football skills, he was a record-setting lacrosse player. He was known as the best lacrosse player of the 20th century. He was then inducted into the College Lacrosse Hall of Fame and the College Football Hall of Fame and NFL Hall of Fame. And in 1983, he was inducted into the Lacrosse Hall of Fame at Johns Hopkins. Brown's fame and financial security came from football, but when he was asked by reporters during his induction to the College Football Hall of Fame what his favorite sport was, he replied, "It's not even close. I love lacrosse." The reason people don't hear a lot about him in the lacrosse world is because at that time there was no opportunity to play professional lacrosse or make any money doing it. Brown made his career choice that allowed him to pursue a football career and go down as one of the greatest athletes of all time. Learning more about the game allows a person to have a greater appreciation for the game. There's a lot more to the game than meets the eye. It's not often people realize the rich history of the game that was started in 1700 by Native Americans and migrated across North America with twists and turns to the look and feel of the game. There were many changes along the way the game was played, the rules that changed, the way sticks have evolved, and the rapid growth of the sports organization competitive tournaments. Lacrosse is now played coast to coast at the community and collegiate level. In the past decade, numerous professional teams have come about, and with the help of Title IX, women have stepped into important roles in the game. Today, there are 671 college men and women's lacrosse teams. There are 45 nations playing the game, and there are only 40 needed for it to be an Olympic sport. Lacrosse will always be known as the fastest game on 2 feet.